Hi there, everybody. This is a Stop TB Canada webinar. I'm Dr. Elizabeth Ray in Toronto, and this webinar is called TB Determined Access to Essential Medicines for Tuberculosis in Canada. So we are very glad to have our speaker today, Adam Houston. Adam is a PhD candidate in law at the University of Ottawa, working at the intersection of health, human rights, and international development. Holds a degree in law from the University of Victoria, a master's in global development studies from Queen's, won the Outstanding Student Award in his master's in health law from the University of Washington. He's worked all over the world for organizations like Treatment Action Campaign, the Pacific Islands AIDS Foundation, Avocats Sans Frontières Canada, and the Institute for Justice and Democracy in Haiti. His work has appeared in publications ranging from Health and Human Rights Journal to PLOS Medicine to Foreign Affairs, and his current research focuses on access to essential medicines in low-burden, high-income countries. And Adam is one of very few people who seem to have a comprehensive grasp on how the TB drug supply system in Canada works. So we're very glad he agreed to do this talk for us today. We're going to do questions at the end of the webinar. So you should all be able to see a chat box on the webinar screen. So if you type questions into the chat box, we'll do those at the end of the Adam's talk. I'd also like to invite everybody to the Union North American Region Tuberculosis Conference, the NTB Conference, which will be taking place in Vancouver, February 21st to 23rd next year. And just a reminder that the early bird rates finish tomorrow. So here's your chance for cheaper conference registration. So the easiest way to find that conference, if this doesn't all sound familiar, is to Google Vancouver Tuberculosis Conference. That usually finds it. And it's hosted on the British Columbia, the BC Lung Association website. So with that introduction, I will turn it over to Adam.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Dr. Ray, and welcome to everybody joining us. Again, to reiterate, perhaps apologize, I am a lawyer. I am coming at this issue from that perspective. So, you know, when we talk about a comprehensive approach, I really am coming from the legal side, and I do hope that this presentation helps to fill some gaps or to answer some questions that you may have. But again, it's not the entire story. Of course, I'm not the one trying to access these medications for my patients. And that's why I'm collaborating with people like Dr. Ray on some projects addressing these issues, and why, you know, I'd like to hear from you, whether in the questions now, or you can see my contact information on the screen at the moment. Always happy to hear from people, always happy to chat about these topics. Okay, let's get into this here, if I can find the right buttons. Okay, so, you know, over the last about year or so, you know, tuberculosis has once again been on the, you know, in the international policy arena. So, you know, a year ago, we had the Moskvaya Deklaratsiya from the WHO Global Ministerial Conference. It was highlighting, you know, some of the key points that I think we're all aware of, right? TB causes more deaths than any other infectious disease worldwide. You know, that this is a really key issue in terms of antimicrobial resistance, right? We can't address that without talking about TB. And of course, that TB disproportionately affects the poorest and most vulnerable populations. Similar themes came up in the first ever UN General Assembly high-level meeting You see here, this is the advertisement suggesting that the high-level meeting should result in an ambitious political declaration on TB. We'll come back to the high-level declaration towards the end. Before we get there, just a reminder when we're talking about vulnerable communities, a reminder who we're talking about in Canada, both who gets TB in Canada and by extension, who doesn't get TB in Canada. And of course, the implications in terms of the attention that these issues get from policymakers. In turn, that also implicates access to medicines, which is what we'll be talking about. Something, again, we've seen a range of guidelines emerge on in recent years. And I'd like to highlight the fact that while things like the high-level declaration, do place a heavy emphasis on things like innovation, which are undoubtedly very necessary, finding new and better treatments for TB, the conversation around access to medicines also includes the drugs that we already have. So here we see in box 1B here, a number of the issues we'll be touching on. First, the issue of a national essential medicines list, including products and formulations needed for TB treatment. Canada doesn't actually have a national essential medicines list. Talking a little bit about forecasting and stockouts even of first-line medications, and then also issues of compassionate use and expanded access mechanisms for drugs, particularly for drug-resistant TB, but also, as we'll see in the Canadian context, other TB drugs. So, essential medicines. What are essential medicines? Right? This is a concept developed by the World Health Organization in the late 1970s. And as I'm just gonna move a tab here. These are defined as medicines that are intended to be available within the context of functioning health systems at all times in adequate amounts, in appropriate dosage forms, with assured quality and adequate information, and at a price the individual and community can afford. Essential medicines also are defined as those that satisfy the priority healthcare needs of the population. And I would suggest that's one of the areas where we run into issues in Canada. What are our priorities and which populations are we talking about? I would also highlight that from a legal perspective, access to essential medicines is considered a core obligation of the right to health under the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So what this means, what a core obligation is that access to essential medicines is something that every government needs to do right away. Access to medicines more broadly, does have implications for resources and so on. That's a progressive movement based on resources that are available, but essential medicines need to be available immediately. Okay, and the WHO's model list of essential medicines, updated every couple of years. The most recent list for adults, there's also some related lists, but the most recent list has 433 drugs. As we see here, a lot of these drugs and drug combinations are for tuberculosis. I'd also like to highlight the fact that of all the TB drugs on this list, only these two, right, bedaquiline and delamanid, right, as I'm sure everyone on this call knows, the only new TB drugs we've had in the past half century or so, these are the only drugs that actually have a valid patent that we'll be talking about today. So, when we're thinking about the classic access to medicines conversation, right, patients versus patents, that isn't the case here. Patents are largely not the barriers to the vast majority of these drugs. Canada, unfortunately, doesn't always do a great job of ensuring access to medicines found on the WHO's essential medicines list. And I'd just like to highlight that quickly with this, the Interagency Emergency Health Kit. Right? This is a collaborative effort between, you can see the list of organizations there at the top. But this is really the most basic distillation of public health, of global health tools. I mean, this is a kit that contains things like, bandages and gloves. It also distills the 433 medicines on the essential medicines list down to the most basic. There are 14 medicines contained in this kit, right? These are medicines like ibuprofen, acetaminophen. But of these 14 medicines, actually we only have 10 of them on the Canadian market. The drugs we're missing include things like albendazole, very widely used, an important antiparasitic drug, and the artemisinin-based antimalarials, which won the Nobel Prize a couple of years ago. Especially as I look out my window in Ottawa here, you think, well, is malaria an issue in Canada? For the 500 or so cases of malaria that we do see in Canada every year, access to these drugs would be useful. And this carries over, of course, to TB. So this is a book that sure folks on this call are familiar with, Canadian Tuberculosis Standards, but I just draw your attention here to Table 7 on second line drugs, and the fact that in our standards, we actually have to make the note that of the drugs in this list, and this list predates bedaquiline and delamanid, more than half of the second line drugs found on this list are not available in Canada, except perhaps pursuant to a practitioner's application for treatment through the Special Access Program. So again, all of these, all the drugs on this list here are old, they're off patent, they're on the essential medicines list. More than half of them are not available in Canada. Furthermore, some of them used to be available in Canada. Here's cycloserine. As you can see here, this was available in Canada 20 years ago until the manufacturer, Eli Lilly, decided that they didn't want to sell it here anymore. So where do we get these drugs? Well, or where do we try and get these drugs? Our primary mechanism for access is this, the Special Access Program. We won't really talk about, N of 1 trials and some other mechanisms like that people have tried. But the Special Access Program, this is it. This is the whole thing. This is the entire legal basis you see on the screen here from the Food and Drug Regulations. There are additional materials for interpreting Special Access Program. That's where we get some of the additional restrictions, like the fact that there's a 6-month limit on the supply of a drug you can receive. Obviously, when we're talking about drug-resistant TB, where we're treating a patient for longer than 6 months, that raises some concerns in and of itself. But looking at the Special Access Program, well, what is it? Well, as it says at the top, this was designed for the sale of a new drug for emergency treatment. An emergency is treated as a serious or life-threatening situation. So this was designed essentially as a bridging mechanism. This is for, a new cancer drug that has just come to market in the United States or the EU, usually a more lucrative market that the pharmaceutical company, wants to start with, but isn't on the market here yet. Usually the company is in the process of registering the drug here in Canada, but it's not available here yet. So we say, well, we don't have another functional treatment available for this patient. We would like to try this new drug that is soon to be available in Canada, but not yet. obviously, when we're talking about new drugs, we do have questions about things like the use, the safety, and efficacy of these drugs. And as the folks at the Special Access Program will occasionally admit, this really isn't designed for accessing essential medicines that we do understand the use, the safety, and efficacy of. Drugs that we've got 50 years of data on those factors, and drugs that aren't in the process of coming to market, that there isn't a lot of interest in bringing to market. And as we saw with cycloserine, drugs that were formerly on the market. So drug that was previously registered by Health Canada for use here 20 years ago, because it's no longer being sold here, it has to be treated like a new drug. So this is a table from a paper we're working on. That's why I've got to cover this up, just because we're trying to get this published. But we looked at Special Access Program requests for a range of TB drugs, mostly second-line drugs that are not sold in Canada. And again, I've got to cover up some of the numbers here, but I'd just like to highlight a couple things. The numbers at the bottom here, we can see that in 2015, there were a couple of hundred approvals for access to these drugs. So, these are drugs that Canadian physicians are using, but about 15% of those requests were not successful. And again, these are requests by specialists for essential medicines for these conditions. In some cases, the request was denied by the Special Access Program, not always with much explanation. In some cases, the request was canceled. There are other logistical factors. For example, the manufacturer couldn't actually supply the drug. And in some cases, the request was withdrawn. One thing this data doesn't reflect is that the Special Access Program, in practice, often faces delays. In theory, it's supposed to be quite rapid, but that isn't always the case when physicians are trying to access these drugs. So in some cases, unfortunately, the process takes long enough that the request is withdrawn by the practitioner because that drug is no longer needed. We see similar figures for 2016. Again, about 15% of requests for these essential medicines by specialists not being accepted. I'd also like to highlight at the bottom rifapentine, which we'll be talking about a bit later, for the treatment of latent TB. And here we see, a very small number of acceptances for these drugs, and this is in part because the Special Access Program, again, is for serious or life-threatening emergencies, and as a result, it's not an easy box to check for rifapentine. Unfortunately, until very recently, as we'll talk about, there wasn't another mechanism to access drugs like this, so have to squeeze the square peg of these essential medicines into the round hole of the Special Access Program. Furthermore, there are some other issues with the Special Access Program, including issues around how they evaluate what gets accepted. So in 2013, where we've got a data set for all special access requests for all drugs, about 30,000 requests for thousands of drugs. This is a very widely used program. There were as many accepted requests for cycloserine as for this 714X. What is 714X? That's a good question. 714X, as we see here, is about 94% water, 5% nitrate. It doesn't really do anything, although it is a Canadian-made product. What it doesn't say on this list here is that it's administered through multiple injections to the groin for cancer and HIV. Again, when the same number of requests are being approved for physicians to access 714X as for cycloserine, really raises some questions about this process. As another example, about a decade ago, there was a piece in the CMAJ by Canadian physicians who were being frustrated in their attempts to access new antiretroviral drugs through the Special Access Program. They were getting these requests declined. And they highlighted that there was something like a 70% acceptance rate for this product. You can also access medical devices through SAP. These are silicone breast implants. During the period that silicone breast implants were not legal in Canada, I'll let you speculate as to what serious or life-threatening conditions were being addressed using these. So, Special Access Program, a number of issues. This also fits into the bigger global picture. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this very photogenic fellow, Martin Shkreli, the self-appointed bad boy of pharma. Martin is famous for hiking the price of another essential medicine, pyrimethamine, which actually appears on the essential medicines list for more than one condition. In North America, we would generally be using it for toxoplasmosis. And Martin was kind of the face, the very photogenic face of a disturbing new trend in pharma pricing. And that's this idea of trolling off-patent drugs. So the realization that where you have a drug that has a very small market, if you're the only manufacturer of that drug, again, serving a small and critical market, you don't need a patent to charge outrageous prices. You've got a de facto monopoly. You don't need those intellectual property protections. Martin's certainly not the only one doing this. Canadian companies like Valiant in particular have done this quite a lot for a number of drugs. Furthermore, this has Canadian implications. For example, this happened to cycloserine, which we'll talk about in a second. This drug was also trolled in this fashion. Single supplier using that leverage to jack up the price. As we see, this is a CBC headline. That's because this price hike also affected Canada because, right, if we don't sell cycloserines in Canada, well, we've got to get it from somewhere. We were getting it from the United States. I think, well, wait, isn't that one of the big factors of Canadian identity is highlighting the fact that we don't have to pay outrageous American drug prices? Don't we have legal mechanisms to protect against that? Well, yes. We do. We have things like the Patented Medicine Prices Review Board, the PMPRB. And indeed, the Supreme Court of Canada has said that the PMPRB actually does have jurisdiction over drugs that are only available through the Special Access Program. However, there's a hitch there. That's the hitch right there, the word patented. New drugs, so bedaquiline and delaminid, in theory, prices could be challenged by the PMPRB, but older drugs that are off patent, we actually don't have a mechanism to keep the prices down. Furthermore, this is a table from a paper by Jonathan Alpern and colleagues in the States. This is highlighting drugs that are at risk of being Shkreli'd. Again, essential medicines, small market, single or just a couple of manufacturers. And I'd like to highlight something in particular. as we see from these arrows here, tuberculosis drugs are very disproportionately at risk of this sort of thing happening. So how does this come about? Well, just tell the story of cycloserine and capryomycin. These are both old drugs, one from the 50s, one from the 60s, and these were Eli Lilly drugs. At some point in time in the late 90s, early 2000s, Eli Lilly decided, you know what? These are old drugs, small markets in wealthy countries anyway. We're not making any money off this. We don't want to sell this anymore. So some markets, like Canada, they pulled out of entirely. But then, more broadly at the global level, they came out with this white paper, seeking solutions to a global health crisis. And, I don't want to be completely cynical about motivations. I mean, there may genuinely have been some positive motivations factoring into this. But the outcome of this program, beginning with this white paper, was that they divested themselves of both of these drugs. They gave these drugs away. Again, there's no patents involved, but these are things like the technological know-how of making them, passing along the manufacturing rights to other companies. In doing this, they split things up into into 7 different geographical regions. So these drugs were divvied up among 7 regions. One of those regions was the US and Canada. Again, small market for these drugs. And indeed, they didn't go to the same place. Capryomycin went to a company called Acorn, and cycloserine went to the Chow Center. The Chow Center is associated with Purdue University. And at the time that they inherited cycloserine, they'd actually never made a drug before. This was actually part of their kind of pharma manufacturing program at the university. Kind of a teaching program. They had a very unrealistic business plan that suggested they would also be able to do this very efficiently. I don't know, maybe abusing student labor, who knows? But to do this very efficiently and actually generate money from this. That quickly proved incorrect. And indeed, the Chow Center in 2015 passed, there's just some Chow Center cycloserine, they passed the rights on again to a place called Rodellis Therapeutics. Rodellis Therapeutics is actually based in Ireland, but this was going to the US headquarters. At the time that this happened, I was actually going to be in Atlanta, where the US headquarters were. Thought about paying a visit, looked it up on Google Street View. It's some dude's house. It's also some dude's house next to a gun store. Declined to visit in person. But this actually turned out to be a rare example where making a bit of a fuss, getting this issue into the headlines actually did have some effect. It turns out that Purdue University, unlike many pharma companies, is actually somewhat susceptible to shame. And they actually fairly promptly acquired cycloserine back from Rodellis. It went back to the Chow Center. In the process, often overlooked is the fact the Chow Center doubled the price. So rather than going from $500 to $10,000 for one of those boxes of pills, it just went from $500 to $1,000. So this is just an example of how these sorts of divestments occur. But now, Special Access Program isn't, as of last year, the only way to access unmarketed drugs in Canada. As of last year, we've got the access to drugs in exceptional circumstances. What are these exceptional circumstances? Well, these are urgent public health needs. As a result, this isn't a physician making a request for an individual patient. Rather, this is a health jurisdiction, so a province or a territory or PHAC requesting access to one of these drugs for a limited 6-month period. Why did this come about? Well, this it does mention a flu pandemic or a military health emergency, but as we'll see, this mechanism was in response to the opioid crisis. In fact, you can see that in the jurisdictions that we're allowed to import these unmarketed drugs from. Those jurisdictions are the United States, the European Union, and Switzerland. Switzerland is, of course, where we would get prescription heroin from. So, how have folks been using this mechanism in practice over the past year and a bit? Well, since it began, 3 jurisdictions, BC, Northwest Territories, and PHAC for use in prisons, have requested products relating to the opioid crisis, Suboxone in various formulations, other prescription heroin. 10 jurisdictions, by contrast, 10 have requested rifapentine for the treatment of latent TB. Again, as we see from the urgent public health need listed, it is in fact listed explicitly as the tuberculosis crisis. So again, this mechanism designed as a response to the high-profile opioid crisis is in fact being used primarily for the much lower-profile tuberculosis crisis. And we see this being mentioned in things like this recent CPHO report, highlighting the fact that rifapentine was placed on the list of drugs for an urgent public health need under the Exceptional Access Program. But again, if you actually look through the development of exceptional access, TB is really not in there. In fact, there's very little evidence that it came up at all. Although I'm waiting on my much delayed access to information complaint to actually get that information from Health Canada. But I'll be happy to share that in the future. Let's look at this a little more, because the Exceptional Access Program actually shed some light on the broader access to essential medicines issue in Canada. First of all, as we see in the regulatory impact analysis statement, first of all, you see a lot of language here about opioids. But secondly, we see some recognition that the Special Access Program isn't effective as a public health measure. I think we might raise some eyebrows about this bit, saying the system works well for individual patient practitioner situations. But it does highlight the fact that it is not intended for a public health emergency. Furthermore, it actually highlights how this comes about. And in fact, the fact that the reasons drugs are not marketed in Canada is a business decision by the manufacturer not to apply for authorization in Canada because, hey, it's a smaller market. And this is often for new drugs, but imagine this for a small market off-patent drug from 50 years ago. Are businesses clamoring to get these drugs on the Canadian market? That's a rhetorical question. So I had a conversation with some folks at Health Canada. I was making some critical comments, as I do, about the Special Access Program, and they highlighted the fact that there is kind of an informal program within Health Canada relating to special access, that when there are drugs that are repeatedly getting requested through special access, they do approach the manufacturers and try and say, hey, you should be selling these in Canada. What can we do here? Classic example of that was Thalamid, right? Repurposed thalidomide as a cancer drug. It was, in years that it was being accessed through SAP, was a huge percentage, by orders of magnitude more than essentially any other drug on the list. It was being requested. That's a little different from many of these essential medicines that, again, people need, but we're talking tens, maybe hundreds of requests. And for all drugs, again, the thousands of drugs accessed through special access, in 2016, Health Canada managed to convince 3 of them to come to market. Last year, 2. This year so far, 1. As a result, Health Canada's persuasive powers to get drugs on the market haven't proven all that effective. We did, however, as of September, after a Nobel Prize, a number of decades, and hundreds of billions of doses, actually get ivermectin registered in Canada for human use. So it's possible, but not frequent. Furthermore, I'd just like to highlight that exceptional access doesn't actually address some of the other concerns. For example, shortages of drugs that are registered in Canada, including TB drugs. There have been a number of shortages in recent years. Drugs that are registered in Canada cannot be accessed through this mechanism, so it does not address that particular issue. So where can you get these drugs? Well, these drugs are available through things like the Global Drug Facility, through Stop TB partnership. Hey, rifapentine, cycloserine, and cycloserine here for much, much cheaper even than the original Chow Center price. Furthermore, who funds this partnership, the Global Drug Facility? Well, Canada has been a founding donor of the facility, was the leading donor for first-line TB drugs, and contributes quite a bit generally. So again, Canada recognizes the importance of access to these drugs elsewhere in the world. Really spends money on ensuring or helping to ensure access to these drugs abroad, but at the same time leaves these inefficient bureaucratic mechanisms in place that inhibit timely access here at home. So that brings us back to the political declaration coming out of the UN high-level meeting, where again, while there was an emphasis on innovation, it's a reminder that we need affordable and available access, not just to new tools, but to existing tools. And furthermore, highlighting potential tools like the Global Drug Facility, as an option to be considered for use by all nations. Encouraging all nations to consider using this mechanism. So there's just some food for thought on some of the potential ways of improving access. I'd just like to end before questions, just highlighting the strange world we live in, where Health Canada does approve, because somebody wants to sell it, a homeopathic remedy drawn from the saliva of a rabid dog, while at the same time, because nobody wants to sell it, we don't have a number of long recognized essential medicines for tuberculosis and other conditions that disproportionately affect the most vulnerable members of our community. So that's it for me. There's my information again. Happy to do some questions now. But again, really do feel free to reach out to me, shoot me an email, share your experiences or your insights or your, secret documents that you've got from somewhere. Always happy to chat. Thank you. And I'm going to turn it over to, I believe Dr. Ray is going to kind of field the question part here.
Thanks very much, Adam. So everybody on the line, this is your chance to ask questions. If you type them into the chat box, I will read them out. So let me start at the beginning here. So I guess this isn't really a question, but a comment. When it comes to access to medications, children often get shortchanged. Such is the case for children with active or latent TB in parts of Canada, such as Nunavut. Do you want to comment on the sort of the pediatric medication aspect of this, or any insights?
Right. No, that's certainly another aspect that we didn't really go into was particular formulations of existing drugs, including drugs that in an adult formulation may be available in Canada, and those are also drugs that people have had varying success trying to access through mechanisms like the Special Access Program. Anecdotally, I've heard that one of the barriers sometimes has been confusion about the fact that, well, this drug is available here, just despite the fact it's not in an appropriate formulation. And that's also an area that highlights another topic we didn't really get into at all, but that of compounding, which for some drugs, has been a stopgap solution. Again, there are some disadvantages to compounding, one of which being obviously that you need facilities and raw materials to do that, which is going to be a lot easier in a major center than elsewhere. Also, some interesting regulatory issues that we won't get into, but we get out of federal jurisdiction when we start talking about compounding, then it becomes a provincial issue in governing pharmacists. Again, we won't get into those issues there, but formulations that are not commercially available, do raise a number of complicated questions. But I agree, it's absolutely a big concern and one that should not be forgotten in any sort of reforms to fix this, to make sure not just that the drugs are available, but that that they're available in appropriate formulations, and that we don't treat the availability of one formulation as sufficient. Thank you.
There's a related question here, which you've touched on some of these issues. What is the likelihood that the newer WHO recommended child-friendly TB fixed-dose combinations can be imported into Canada through the Global Drug Facility, the access to drugs in exceptional circumstances, or other mechanisms within the next 3 years? So you did touch on some of those issues. For example, compounding of drugs is a lot less available up in Nunavut. So to make child-friendly TB medications, the way that you can get them compounded in southern pharmacies. So there's that general question. The other piece that I want to pick up from that is the part about importing into Canada through the Global Drug Facility, because during the whole cycloserine price increase crisis, I actually contacted the Global Drug Facility to try and figure out how we could get some cycloserine for some of the multi-drug resistant TB patients here in Toronto. The Global Drug Facility was willing to give it to us, but Health Canada said the regulations only allowed them to permit importation direct from a manufacturer, not from sort of a warehouse operation, which is basically what the Global Drug Facility is. They don't make the medications. They just distribute them. So we still wouldn't have been able to import cycloserine, apparently, through that mechanism. And is that still an issue now?
Right. So yeah, there's a couple issues there. One is this issue of of getting drugs of again, proven quality and so forth, that are available through the global drug facility that Canadian money is already contributing to. I mean, that appears to still be an issue, but kind of at that regulatory level. What is the logic to having barriers between a willing supplier that, again, we're funding, and getting them here? I mean, this idea that it would have to go through a manufacturer, directly from a manufacturer, for example. I mean, that's bureaucracy, and that is the kind of bureaucracy that can change, but that there doesn't seem to be a lot of political interest or will in changing. To the other question in terms of importation through the exceptional access mechanism, and again, to be clear, the only importation mechanisms we can use at the moment are our special access program and exceptional access. Global drug facility would be a source for those drugs, potentially. That would be an issue of, again, can we convince the appropriate health jurisdiction that the need for access to those drugs reaches the level of an urgent public health need? If there's a convincing case to be made for that, as we've seen being made for LTBI and rifapentine in, again, 10 jurisdictions in Canada, potentially that is workable. But again, it's an issue of making a case that it reaches that level. Yes, I think that was what I was going to say about that.
Okay, thanks. Here's another question. How might Health Canada compel manufacturers to apply for marketing approval in Canada? Many manufacturers balk at the cost with listing products in Canada. As such, is the exceptional access list problematic in that it may divert TB drug manufacturers to this mechanism instead of applying for standard approval and bearing those costs of standard approval and licensing?
Right. No, that is a very good question. I certainly grappled with that with some of the other drugs for NTDs, for example. So through special access, albendazole and previously ivermectin were actually being given for free by the manufacturers. They were actually donating to Canadian patients those drugs for free, with special access as kind of the gatekeeper a bit, keeping numbers down. Because then they also saved the costs of things like registration and so on. And it's hard to really muscle in on a company when they're saying, well, we're already giving you the drug for free. In terms of compelling companies to sell drugs, that is, that always comes up. My concern, or one of them, would be that you try and convince a company, say Eli Lilly, to provide or register their drug here. That's an incentive for them, honestly, to divest, to say, well, actually, that's no longer in our portfolio, and then you're dealing with, even with the Martin Shkrelis of the world. So compulsion. I kind of like the idea. I always like the idea of, hey, if you want to sell your new erectile dysfunction drug, we also need you to be making these. But in practice, that is probably going to be difficult. There's maybe a little more leeway, and this is a little more in the States, to at least keep the companies that are manufacturing them from divesting irresponsibly, but yeah, in the Canadian context, where they're not here, at all, that's a tough question. And we have seen, negotiations behind the scenes, lowering the costs to get things on the market and so on. In some cases, companies have been interested, but in other cases, even with reduced costs behind the scenes, it has not been considered worth their while. I still don't understand why it isn't even just as a PR investment. Hey, these are medicines so good that they are proven essential, and they help our most vulnerable communities. Why that's not good PR at a time when the pharma industry could use good PR, but that doesn't seem to be working either. So the very short answer is compulsion is very unlikely to work, and none of the other options seem all that favorable in terms of emphasizing the manufacturer, and that is perhaps one reason why going through somewhere like the Global Drug Facility, where we're not trying to deal directly with the manufacturer, and we aren't buying from a manufacturer who wants to save money by not registering, might be one nice option.
Okay, thanks. Okay, next question. Will Health Canada recommend preventive testing like quantiferon or IGRA testing? You could take a stab at that, but maybe the thing to highlight out of that is, could other Health Canada mechanisms be used to improve access, not to medications, but to test kits, laboratory testing?
Right. That's a good question. This is one of these points where I'm going to reiterate that I'm most certainly not a physician, and I don't play one on the internet. Diagnostic tools and things like that. There are other medical devices, and someone can you can get them in theory through the special access program. I found out that that's where you get leeches. Interesting. So hopefully smoothing those processes, removing barriers, saying, these are proven, these are vital. These are things that we have seen actually in some other jurisdictions. Australia has just reformed their similar to special access program to kind of say, this is an emergency, we're going to make it a lot easier. And this is less of an emergency, but this drug is proven. It's got a good track record. We're also going to really loosen the strings. There's paperwork, but let's do the paperwork after the patient gets the drug. So again, simplifying those things and making sure that they apply not only to treatments, but to other steps in the process is a good idea, and we shouldn't lose sight of how these mechanisms could apply to these other important aspects of care. At the moment, I would have to double check. I don't believe that exceptional access can be used for that, but I would want to double check that before saying that definitively.
Okay. Here's another exceptional access question. Does the exceptional access list have the potential to create non-uniform access across Canada by requiring each province to separately apply for each drug? Is there any mechanism for Health Canada or PHAT to list these products to make them available equally across the country?
Yes, absolutely. At the moment, the way it's set up does kind of promote unequal access. It's based on which jurisdiction is willing to say that there's an urgent public health need. If every jurisdiction is willing to say that, then we don't have that issue. But no, in terms of kind of a blanket mechanism to say that for everywhere in Canada we're just going to make this available, there's no clear mechanism for that. One would hope that obviously the fact it's available in some areas would influence the decision to make it available in others. But no, there's no clear mechanism that just allows blanket access.
Okay. And if I can follow up with a little bit related question, if things are being applied for under the sort of urgent public health need mechanism, as far as I understand, in practice, what that has meant is that the province that have applied for those medications have paid for them out of the public purse. So it's not like, Ontario got a special license to import something and put it for retail sale in pharmacies. It was actually covered by the provincial Ministry of Health. Is that part of the legislation, though?
That is a good question that I would want to revisit before answering definitively. I kind of would have said off the top of my head that it was a bit looser than that, because it is the pharmacies bringing them in. I'd want to read the regs again, basically. But yeah, I mean, everything that's been coming in, to my knowledge, has been covered kind of by the public purse, right? These are emergency things, for be it opioids or TB, and it's a little hard to conceive of an emergency, of something that would be considered an emergency or urgent public health need, that at the same time would also be something that they put the burden on the consumer. But that is a good question that I am going to look up after this call.
Okay, because I can see that being part of the issue about unequal access, because it's not just that each province or territory has to decide to apply for it. In essence, they'd also be agreeing to pay for it.
Right.
Okay. We just have a couple of minutes left, so if anybody wants to type a last-minute question into the chat box, we probably can squeak time for one more question. But Adam, thanks very much for doing this talk. From the kind of on-the-ground public health and clinical care level, the whole TB drug supply system in Canada often feels like a big black box. So very much appreciate you doing this talk for us. There aren't any other questions coming up right now in the chat box.
All right.
So thank you everybody for listening. We will be sending a notification out shortly about the next Stop TB Canada webinar happening on, I believe, January 24th. Dr. Dick Menzies will be talking about his recently published study using 4 months of rifampin for LTBI treatment. So look for that announcement, and thanks again to Adam, and thanks to everybody who signed in.
All right, and I would just like to end by saying that I'd like to highlight the fact that at least some of these barriers are indeed regulatory. You can blame the lawyers, that's what we're here for. Blame the politicians too. But the things that are rules, that are regulations, those can change. It's just a matter of getting the momentum and convincing the people who have the power to change them. That won't fix all of the access issues. It doesn't make pharma companies, want to spend money on things that don't make them money in return, for example. But things like special access program absolutely could be fine-tuned, could be improved. So, I'd encourage you to speak out when you have the opportunity. Thank you.
A good way to end. There's one last minute question, if we can maybe squeak access to the webinar line longer. Might the federal government be motivated to bulk purchase TB drugs in the future? And we'll make that the very last question.
I would like to hope so. I don't know exactly what that the mechanism to do that would be, but I don't know that I think that they could be convinced. I would like to leave it on that optimistic note. Hopefully, we can all work together to fill in the blanks on how to do that later.
Okay. Thanks very much, Adam. Thanks, everybody, for calling in, and have a good day. It's a very Canadian ending.